So I've got a couple minutes after, so let's go ahead and get started. This is a session caring with and about data for our ECIP meeting. There is a poll to go over sort of what's your level of experience. Slido.com / hashtag care data. There will, if you slip over from that, there will also be a place to ask some Q&A. So session outline is here. Allison, do you want to go ahead and do the sort of the community guidelines and that piece of the introduction?
Take it away, Bruce. You got this.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. So as is indicated, and I'm going to put another link in here, this is being done in ECIP. We have our community guidelines. If there are any problems, feel free to reach out to any ECIP staff member to help address those. And fundamentally, be kind, be respectful, and we'll be in great shape. So with this session outline, we're going to hear from some different perspectives on managing data in ways that are consistent with the CARE principles. It's organized as a panel presentation, and I'll provide some info about the panelists here in just a minute. There is the Google Doc for this session that's been in chat, and we can drop that link here again in a minute. At the end of that Google Doc, there are some resources that are available for further information, and particularly for those with more experience, if you have some other resources that we didn't include in that, do feel free to add those into the document. Please also put in your name and other information at the top of the document. I don't have a specific follow-up, but there may be some follow-up that comes out of, for example, the Sustainable Data Cluster that Ruth is here representing. And as I thought about this, I'll throw a framing out for consideration, which is, as we walk through the session today and think about this in the days, weeks, months to come, at least from my perspective, what I'm asking myself is, what should I start doing or do more of? What should I keep doing? And what should I stop doing or do less of in this context of care? So we have 3 panelists today. Andrew Martinez will lead off. Andrew currently serves as the research coordinator for the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. He is a citizen of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community and also Diguano Ipe with ties to the Mesa Grande Band of the Mission Indians in San Diego County. He graduated with a business management degree at the Eller College of Management in 2015 with a double major in American Indian Studies and Government and Public Policy at University of Arizona. He then started as a research specialist working with Dr. Stephanie Carroll, working in the Indigenous Data Sovereignty area. This began with some organizing, presenting at the first ever Indigenous Open Data Summit at the International Open Data Conference in Spain. For the last 7 years, Andrew and Dr. Carroll have worked to identify pathways to bring the Indigenous data sovereignty and governance framework into the view of researchers, university administrators, data repositories, and policymakers. He is an author of several relevant articles, some of which I have linked to in the resources section. Aaron Hester is the director of the University of California Merced Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society, or CITRIS, at the Bonato Institute. She is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at UC Merced, and she's an expert in environmental remote sensing to support scientific and monitoring applications, biodiversity, species invasion, aquatic ecology, biochemistry, and water quality at multiple scales, local to continental. She is the co-PI and aquatic lead for Bioscape, the Biodiversity Survey of the Cape, NASA's first biodiversity campaign. She's the author of over 100 scholarly works and currently serves as a subject matter expert for NASA's VSWIR instrument on the Surface Biology and Geology Mission, or SBG. It is a member of the NASA Biodiversity and Ecological Conservation Science Team, the NASA Ocean Color Research Team, and the NSF Internet of Things for Precision Agriculture Engineering Research Center. And she says her favorite animal is the eastern gray kangaroo. Ruth Dewar is a research scholar with the Ronan Institute. She's a generalist with interests in nearly everything from music and art to science, data, and policy, with stops for many other things along the way. She's been actively involved in the Earth, space, and information and data sciences for many years. I first met Ruth in her role with the National Snow and Ice Data Center, or NSIDC, when I first joined the Earth Science Information Community back in 2006. Ruth's recent projects cover topics ranging from sustainable data management practices to developing frameworks for discovery and access to science data for multi-disciplinary and cross-disciplinary data users, to investigating the events and circumstances that led to wider community adoption of data and information, to the semantics involved in natural language and machine learning, and most recently working with members of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, GIDA, on how repositories can implement the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. So Andrew is going to start, and so I will stop with my share. I will point out here, let me get to this page. Looking at the survey, about 28% are saying I've read CARE before. Also 28 I've explored how it relates to my work. 22 worked with them in my job, 16%. So a lot of people getting started with CARE principles and some with some expertise. So hopefully we have a productive conversation today. So Andrew, if you will go ahead and take it away.
Hey. All right, and we are live. All right. Thank you everyone for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Been working with some repository folks over the last few years, so it's great to have a presentation here at the ESIP meeting this year. My name is Andrew Martinez, Skuktosh, calling from my home in Sacramento, California. I do work for the University of Arizona, but I've been remote basically since 2016, which is also when I started working with Dr. Stephanie Carroll in the Indigenous data sovereignty and governance world. And so it's been a lot of advocacy since that point, but at the same time, we have seen some movement, some uptake by non-Indigenous institutions, again, sort of mentioned the bio researchers, university admin, repositories, and funders as well. So it's been great to see that continued movement. It has been incremental steps at some points, but at the same time, it's been great to see this work continue to expand and grow. This presentation is going to be a collection of a lot of minds, and some of which are mentioned here at the bottom, as well as Dr. Riley Tatingfong and Stephanie Carroll as well. So to get started, and I'm happy that that poll was there. Thank you for doing that. It's great to hear that some folks do have some familiarity with CARE. But I want to start with, before we jump into that, I always like to start and make sure that everyone has a foundational understanding of what Indigenous data are, Indigenous data sovereignty as a whole. And so the definition of Indigenous data is data, information, knowledge in any format. This can be binary or non-binary, digitized or not, that impacts Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities as a collective and individual levels. And I'm going to emphasize the collective and the individual throughout the presentation as well. So data about our non-human relations, our relationships with land, water, and soil. A lot of our partners that we work with on projects are in the earth sciences. So I think this is sort of hits home as well. And a couple examples I could share later on too. Data about us as individuals. And so we get into the administrative, the legal, and health, social, commercial data. Data collected by other governments for us, data collected by other governments for them, us being Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples. This can be within the US context, outside of the US context, domestic or foreign. Data about us as collectives. I think within the mainstream areas, data about individual rights are largely emphasized within that that realm, mainstream data ecosystem, but within the purview or the scope of Indigenous peoples, one of the things that we try to focus on is data about the collectives. So data about traditional roles, cultural information, language, knowledges, and ancestral clan knowledges as well. These are all areas that of interest and protection that we would like to have more of. So Indigenous data sovereignty, the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data, derives from inherent rights, and rights that were established prior to colonization, prior to the existence of the nation states in which we engage with today, rights that can only be recognized by national or state governments as well. The genesis and traditional roles and responsibilities. And so when we talk about Indigenous frameworks, we're talking about contemporary frameworks in which we use, but also traditional frameworks as well. And so traditional protocols in which our community members have engaged in specific roles that they've held, and positions they've held, not just within tribal governments, but within community, to protect and hold and communicate tribal knowledge as well. Position within a human rights framework, and here we shift more to the contemporary side of it. So within the US, we have the federal recognition status, and I think we have about 574, 575 federally recognized tribes in the US right now. But we also must remember that we have state recognized tribes, largely on the East Coast of the US, and we have those tribal communities who are also unrecognized. Expanding beyond that, beyond the US, there are First Nations recognition in Canada, but there's also in the global South, and South America and Africa and other areas in South Asia. Indigenous communities do not have legal frameworks that they can engage with. And so it is more of a challenge, but that push for Indigenous data sovereignty and recognition is still there. So it's been cool to have those partners and learn from them as well. And then an emphasis back again that knowledge belongs to collective and is fundamental to who we are as Indigenous peoples. And I should mention, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll try to get to them after the presentation here. So I was asked to talk about the CARE principles. I'm going to hopefully shift y'all up from like a 2 to 3, a little higher soon. So the CARE principles was published in 2019, I'm sorry. Were a bit of a response to the FAIR data principles, and really brought in a focus to an issue or the issues that were being brought forward within the open science, open data area for Indigenous communities. And it really, it was a response, and it was a kind of a push for us to say, we need to be a part of this conversation. And the CARE principles are an introduction to a conversation about open data, open sciences, and the harms, but also the benefits that can arise from that. So CARE is a large acronym, beginning with C, collective benefits. Data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous people to derive benefits. So collective benefit, the CAR, are the higher level principles. Then we have our sub principles, of which there are 3 in each of those. I'll highlight some throughout the presentation here. For improved governance and citizen engagement. Tribes can use data that's in repositories so long as they know about it for their governmental decision-making abilities. And also for equitable outcomes once they are able to engage with and understand what is being housed within data repositories as well. Moving on, authority to control. Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized by and their authority to control such data respected. So repositories and federal, right now there is government to government relationships that exist within the US and tribal communities. So recognition of those rights and interests can be expanded to extend to repositories, researchers, universities. There are those cooperative research agreements right now that exist. And then when we talk about data for governance and data of governance, this is a cyclical pattern beginning with data for governance. And so understanding from the tribal community standpoint, what data is out there about us, which can at times be difficult to find. I have my own stories of trying to find data about my community in San Diego, California. Mesa Grande Band of Mission Indian is kind of hard. And so that data can be used and brought back to the community to better understand what's going on within our communities and also external communities around us as well. So data for governance, we talk about data coming back into the community. As that data comes back into the community, it can then cycle back around and be utilized to make better governance decisions. And at that point can be, the tribal community can have a better exercise over that data as it exits out of the community again. And so begins that sort of cyclical pattern of data coming in and data for governance being applied, and then data of governance and greater exercise of data governance on that as it is utilized. For responsibility are working with Indigenous data, have a responsibility, those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how that data are used and support Indigenous self-determination, collective benefit. Baseline starting, maybe there isn't an understanding or communication out to Indigenous peoples of what data is there and how it's being applied. Though it was collected in tribal lands. It's just how it's gone. Data has been, extracted. There's been a push to have better controls of research policies and engagement with tribal communities. I'm happy to be a part of that push, myself and my other, fellow Indigenous scholars as well, to better increase or develop positive relationships with Indigenous communities, to have those conversations about what it can look like if that data is accessed and tribal communities have the ability to utilize to build capability and capacity with data that's there. And for the continued development of languages and worldviews for Indigenous peoples as well. And this is a two-way street here. And this is something we've come across in the conversations with our research partners as well. So ethics, care and ethics. Indigenous peoples' rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of data lifecycle and across the data ecosystem. So today we're focusing on the area of what repositories can do. But as sort of mentioned in the bio and a lot of the work that we do in our projects, we engage with researchers, we engage with tribal communities, we engage with university. We're working more and more to engage with funders because we're identifying areas where it's like, well, this isn't our responsibility, this falls on the funders. Well, if you have a relationship with funders, let us know. We'd love to talk to them more and more. We do have some inroads with like NSF and NIH, but it's still time. It's taking time to have those conversations and make them understand like, hey, there needs to be some privacy here, a little bit of more control and governance and better stewardship of Indigenous data. But it's the funding policies that need to change at some point. So for ethics, minimizing harm and maximizing benefits, these come up a lot. It's really interesting to have these conversations with folks at all levels of the research process for what minimizing harm and maximizing benefits can look like. Data for justice, data coming back into the communities can be utilized and build, again, links back to capacity. And data for future use. And this sort of begins to hit on the data of governance and the data for governance conversation as well. And so just to highlight now, there is some interlinkages with the care principles, and now they're not exclusive to one of the larger principles or the higher level principles of collective benefit, authority, control, responsibility, and ethics. Those sub-principles do interlink, and I'm going to sort of show a little bit of that work as I move forward. So shifting out of care principles here, I want to show a couple examples. Some of the work that we have ongoing, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and led by Dr. Riley Tidingfong, is the development of phases for care implementation in data repositories. And this has been about a 2 to 3 year project that's been ongoing. It's picked up more steam in the last year, really looking at stewardship of Indigenous data toward practical action for improving Indigenous data governance. And so what has happened is through continued conversations with new research partners and old research partners as well, we've started to develop and understand, like, we're answering sort of the same questions. We're making similar suggestions. And also we need to have a conversation about pumping the brakes a little bit. And so implementing care and repositories phases framework. Thus far, and this is still new and in the works, we've developed 5 phases of what care implementation could look like. Now, repository folks with an understanding of care could literally start wherever. That's out of our hands. What we're trying to do is provide recommendations as to if you're going to want to implement care, but also make it sustainable. These are areas of interest that you should be paying attention to or could start at as well. So this is where I get at the pumping the brakes action there as well. So for today's talk, due to time constraints, I'm just going to hit on the recommendations that come out of phase 0. And we really started, I want to emphasize the 0 part. It's not dig at anyone. It's literally just like, okay, well, we want to start, but we have to go back. We have to start at literally 0. And again, this goes to the sustainability of care implementation. And so activities right now that are listed here engage in less necessary learning and sovereignty and self-determination, understand UNDRIP, understand IDSOV and Gov and care principles. So it's awesome that Google Doc is there with some recommendations in there, and I can add some more in there too later on. Reckon with the settler colonial legacy at your institution. And this is broad. When we use institution, we can be talking about repositories. We could be talking about universities as well. One of the things that I like to point at is number 4, assess existing policies and procedures. So part of the conversations that we have with folks when we're talking to them is like, what are your procedures as far as data collection, data stewardship, storage, and so on? And understanding, from your understanding of where data governance and data sovereignty, do those policies help or hinder? And is it possible to, adapt those policies following the assessment, redraft them, sometimes in partnership with Indigenous communities, so you better understand what they are looking for, and move forward that way. And that assessment, again, we put that in phase 0, but those sort of assessment processes go on throughout the phases as well. And so it's not just exclusive to this section here. And number 6, I like to point out, enriching relationships with Indigenous peoples locally, domestically, and globally. It really could depend on what sort of collections you have in your repositories and where they came from as well. Oh, and one of the examples that I wanted to point out is some of the work that we've been doing with ESIP partners here, Ruth being one of the co-authors of the paper that we're working on. Is forthcoming paper, Earth Science and Data Repositories Implementing the CARE Principles. It's been great to work with Ruth, Lourdes, and Margaret on this as well. And so they were able to come up with the repository actions that were about 45 to 46 actions that they then themed into 4 topic areas. Those topic areas being situational awareness, outreach, repository protocols, and then technical. And I wanted to point out again, 1, CARE sub-principles of CARE are engaging with different areas throughout care. And so one of the, within situational awareness, they brought forward 10 recommendations. I say nascent recommendations that we're moving forward with and sort of worked out and been workshopping. We'll continue to workshop actually next Monday as well. So just to point out, understand Indigenous legal rights. That sort of begins to link back to, excuse me, phase 0 of care implementation that we previously talked about on the last slide, and further emphasizes from care as well. So this sort of stuff, the ESIP team came up with these recommendations, which I thought was great because it wasn't us in their ears. They kind of worked on their own, came back to us, and I was honestly really happy to see what they were able to come up with, because some of it was beyond the scope of what we think about within the collaboratory. And so, plus, it was helping us at the collaboratory, team members who were engaging with this, to better understand how repositories operate, which has been, I think, a two-way street for us in doing this work with the ESIP team. So it's been a fun project to work on. It's been a long project to work on. And I think Ruth can attest to that too, but I'm happy to see where it is now. And so I'm happy to see the list of recommendations they come up with, even 40 plus. But it was good to see the linkages between those actions that they came up with, the recommendations, and how care intertwines into those. And so the figure may be a little chaotic, but as you grow more and more familiar with care, you understand like why these linkages exist and why it's not just a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. And to end with today, sorry, I just want to make sure I'm within time. And to end with today, we are organizing the first National Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance Summit for 2024. This will be happening in April in Tucson. You can find out more information. I can link this to the chat here as well, usindigenousdatanetwork.org. As of right now, we have about 70 accepted abstracts. We're still working to confirm speakers there. We have 4 keynote speakers lined up. And this has been the culmination of a long time coming since COVID to want to host a national Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance Summit, because we wanted to find out, we have our working group, but we want to find out what else and what sort of work is going on in what areas. And so this presentations will cover public health, community language, finance, environmental samples and data collection there as well, cultural knowledge, a wide breadth, all with the interlinkages of Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Governance there. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. Early bird registration ends, I believe, February 14th. So if you're interested in getting into the lower price, go ahead and do that. So I will shift over. Thank you for the time today, and look forward to questions and hearing the rest of the panelists talk as well. Let me slide out.
Perfect, thanks. So Aaron is the next presenter. She'll be talking from the perspective of the Bioscape campaign. And that looks good, Aaron, thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me to join this panel. And thank you, Andrew, for those thoughtful overview comments. I am going to be sharing with you some of the perspectives of a PI and kind of the project level considerations in implementing care principles. And so let's see. Oops. Bioscape, I'd like to introduce, is a project that is funded by the NASA as well as the National Research Foundation in South Africa. And it is the Biodiversity Survey of the Cape. This is really the first time NASA has turned its attention toward biodiversity in executing a very large airborne and field campaign. And I'm here speaking on behalf of not only the Bioscape leadership team, which includes both myself, Adam Wilson, and Jasper Slingsby, as well as Annabelle Cardoso and Cherie Forbes, but also a network of over 150 scientists from 30 institutions who've all been involved in this very large project. And the motivations for Bioscape is that we need global biodiversity observations, and we really need to understand how to do that. But we need to make these observations at very fine scales and at high temporal frequency because biodiversity is so variable all around the world. And remote sensing has the potential to get us there much of the way, but remote sensing alone isn't going to help us fully characterize the diversity of life on planet Earth. And it's long been recognized in the biodiversity community is that we need local observations and we need to incorporate traditional, local, and indigenous knowledge into our observations in order to both better interpret the remote sensing products and fully monitor and therefore conserve life on Earth as we know it. And so the Bioscape project focused on looking at South Africa as its target region as really a microcosm of the global challenges that we face for conservation. One of the reasons we went to South Africa is because it is one of the world's global biodiversity hotspots. In an area that's less than 1% of Africa, it contains 20% of all of Africa's plants. It has some of the highest rates of both terrestrial and marine endemism in the world. And it is also experiencing very rapid species loss. It is a global extinction hotspot. And South Africa has also been called one of the most unequal countries in the world. And the Gini Index is one of, I think just last year, South Africa rose to the top globally. And so it has a very complex history and ongoing social challenges related to these inequalities around social development and colonialism. And so we have these pressures coming from development, environmental change through climate and other pressures on the environment, coupled with these biodiversity losses, really make it an ideal place for us to test our technologies and test our ways of developing and managing data that maybe we can use to scale globally. So what Bioscape did is we deployed 3 imaging spectrometers and 2 LiDAR on 3 aircraft. 2 aircraft were provided by NASA, and one of those aircraft was provided by the South African Environmental Observation Network. And we flew just last year from October into November over the greater Cape Floristic region and adjacent marine regions of South Africa. And the premise of the science was that we had this very large collection of remote sensing data and in situ data. So in addition to a lot of satellite data acquisitions, including acquisitions from sensors on board the International Space Station, EMIT and EcoStress, we had those aircraft collecting imaging spectroscopy and LiDAR data. And then we had a very large team in the field that were collecting everything from phytoplankton functional types and plant functional types to the spectroscopy of leaves and canopies, to measuring, just doing straight bird counts and animal counts, to more novel technologies such as measuring the environmental DNA in waterways or measuring the acoustic landscapes to characterize frog and insect diversity. And the goal of this project is to really bring all of those data sets together in order to characterize the functional diversity, the taxonomic diversity, phylogenetic diversity, and spectral diversity of the region, which we need to do if we're going to better conserve nature and understand its contributions to people. And so as an airborne campaign, Bioscape is really a pathfinder for helping us develop these cutting-edge remote sensing technologies and field data to provide a better understanding of biodiversity. And it's also helping us prepare for when these data become available from satellites, which is rapidly approaching. And so one of the things that we've also really struggled with is, can we also think about using Bioscape to create a model of better engagement with local or indigenous knowledge that can scale as well? So the biodiversity community, the scientific community, has had a long and very sordid history of parachute science, meaning that wealthy investigators from the West, primarily Europe and North America, are parachute, if you will, into these much poorer countries that have high rates of biodiversity. They extract knowledge from these communities, they publish their papers, and they never bring local benefit or the scientific findings back to those communities. And so early on in the process, it was really important for Bioscape for us to do what we could to really avoid parachute science. And so I want to take you through some of the elements of care that we really thought about throughout the Bioscape project. And I think one of the first things that really comes to mind, and repositories could play an important role here in terms of education and outreach, is thinking about co-design from the very beginning of the Bioscape project. And so NASA program leadership, in concert with us, really thought about this as well. And so they actually embedded some elements of co-design in the solicitation. And so I've just shown some of the snippets of requirements in that solicitation that really helped us make sure that we did have co-design with local partners. And in addition to that, we held a workshop at the American Geophysical Union fall meeting in 2021, where we brought a panel of experts who had both positive and negative experiences with international collaboration to really talk about the elements of how to do international collaboration ethically and what are the pitfalls of potentially conducting parachute science. And so we nonetheless, we were able to form this Bioscape science team, and nonetheless, we still faced real barriers. And the biggest one, of course, is funding. And so because this was a federally funded NASA project, we were not able to send funds to our South African partners. Obviously, this is, a huge barrier to really participating in this ethically across international lines. However, we did partner with the South African government to seek funding for South African teams as well. And so we had a solicitation that resulted in a total, now this is out of date, we actually have 19 funded projects, including 2 that were funded by the South African government. And that project was managed by the Earth Science Project Office in Logistics and Planning. So we ended up with a large number of institutions involved from both South Africa and from the United States, and wound up with a science team of about 157 scientists and roughly 50-50 membership across the US and South African institutions as people identified themselves. So one of the other things that we were able to do to really think about, or one of the things we did to implement some of those ideas of benefits for local knowledge holders, and reinforcing ethical frameworks of data collection and publication with our PIs, is that we hired an applications coordinator, Cherie Forbes, who's local in South Africa, to really think about how we can enhance applications of the data collected in Bioscape for the good of local communities and local institutions. We held a workshop in May prior to the flights, where we involved local knowledge holders and stakeholders to the table to really educate our PIs about what their data needs were and what benefit they saw they could get or requested getting out of these data. We also included ethical training around things. We strove to be Nagoya compliant and make sure that we maintain bioethical frameworks, and encouraged our PIs to think about mutually agreed upon terms for data collection in lands around South Africa. And we also required a mandatory ethical participation workshop right before the field campaign and flights for all of our scientific PIs. Now, we've done a lot to really help with thinking about these things, but we also faced barriers here as well. And one of the key ones is that in a lot of those mutually agreed upon terms, in order to be Nagoya compliant, most of the locals in South Africa really are not against bioprospecting. So that's, going and getting biological information, genetic information, and then bringing it back and turning that into profitable sequences for things like drug development. Now, part of NASA's open data policy means that we will publish those data, and while the Bioscape team does not have an intent to perform bioprospecting, once those are published, a third party could come in and use those data for those purposes. So there are some challenges and, again, barriers within the framework of both federal funding and federal policies that haven't allowed us to completely manage all of the ethical frameworks that we wanted to in this project. We are planning to publish and are starting to publish all of our data in the ORNL DAC, which we've been working with Bruce and his team very closely on, and really thinking about how to implement these principles in the DAC from really the inception of the project. And again, there are both advantages but limitations to the public availability of these data. Just because the data are publicly available doesn't mean that they're actually going to be accessible to our South African partners, many of whom don't have access to the computational resources needed to actually gain benefit from these data. And so we're lucky that we've been able to secure AWS sponsorship for cloud computing resources for the next 3 years. And we're working on a series of trainings for our South African partners to enable them to use cloud computation to access these very large data sets that they otherwise would not be able to access through their home institutions due to limitations in computing in their home institutions. And another critical aspect, as I referred to earlier, was that we were working through capacity building and really improving the data capabilities of our local knowledge holders. And that included things like holding science communication trainings for our scientists to enable them to better communicate with one another, but also to communities that can benefit from the data. This includes online courses covering the use of data, and those have been run by NASA's Applied Sciences program, the ARSIT training courses. We've engaged locally with graduate students within South Africa through the Indibano network. And we were one of the challenges in NASA's Very Large Space Apps Challenge. In addition to that, we've also really tried to give some authority of the data to South Africans, and they've essentially said, we don't want the data volumes, but we do want to have some control and some participation in this. And so Bruce and his team through Bioscape have been engaging with local data distributors through the South African Environmental Observation Network, so that we will be able to create some sort of local visibility within the data portals that South African end users are working on. So Bioscape is, of course, really a story of people, and it's been really exciting to see between the scientists and the engineers and the practitioners. We had about a team of 230 people involved in this project last fall and continue to be involved now in the data curation and publication. But this is also a story of institutions. And while they have supported us quite a lot, we've also have a long way to go. One of the key things that we did in this when we did local engagement is we really focused on local institutions and local knowledge holders, but not necessarily Indigenous knowledge holders. And many of the institutions in South Africa also have a long history of oppression and a failure to engage with Indigenous communities, as I think we're all aware of South Africa's long history of colonialism and apartheid. And so one of the things that we could work on better as a project is thinking about how we engage more deeply with Indigenous communities within the South African context, as well as thinking about more creative ways of working with funders and working with policy to get through some of those institutional barriers back home that have limited our availability to enact all the care principles that we would like to in this project. I think that I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation about, what PIs face when they try to engage in this process.
Cool. Thanks, Erin. And last up is Ruth Dewar, representing the Sustainable Data Management Working Group. And I've just updated the resources to include the link to those notes that was posted in the questions. Thanks, Erin. So,
Yes,
Ruth.
indeed. Thanks, Aaron. So my name's Ruth Dewar. I'm with the Ronan Institute for Independent Scholarship. But before that, I was at the University of Colorado in Boulder at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. One of the projects I worked on was the ALOCA project, the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic. And that's where I began my work with Indigenous data and Indigenous peoples. Back then, that was pre-care principles. So, but currently I'm with the Sustainable Data Management Cluster, which is really started to try and figure out how repositories could become sustainable. And I'm not quite sure how we got started working on the care principles, but it's been something that community has been working on now for about 3 years. So it's been really a long time. And Andrew gave a very nice summary of what the paper will look like. And we do have a link to a draft of it that Aaron put in the Slido. So if you want to take a look at it, that would be good. I think she has the most recent draft. I didn't actually check to make sure. No, actually she has a link to actually the notes, and that has links to the various and sundry versions of the paper. And I must admit, in the run up to this particular session, I realized that the cluster chair, Margaret, and has been working on in the ESIP Google Drive rather than the online wiki, and the links on the website go to the wiki, not the Google Drive. Anyways, so I apologize for that. We'll have to fix that in the near future, I hope. In any case, so the group is basically a group of repository people, and they were all interested in how to implement care. And so we've been working with Stephanie and her crew for a long time and have come up with the things that that Andrew gave you a brief look at. I note that the next thing that the group is thinking about working on is related to some other work that has come out of the Indigenous community, which is basically about metadata, there's a indigenous metadata communique, which basically talks about what kinds of metadata should there be. And metadata is near and dear to most repository people's hearts. So if given the chance, I think this group would like to help work on that. So if you're interested, let me know and start coming to our meetings, which are on the calendar. Thank you, Aaron, for the link to the bundle. I can't do that kind of thing in real time. In any case, I don't have a lot to say beyond what Andrew already talked about. So I'm going to stop it there. I do see a lot of questions coming up on Slido, and maybe we can go to those.
That be the plan. I would just add one piece to what Aaron said. We've talked a couple of times with the South African Ecological Observation Network around really this whole question of control. What we know that we have a plan for is a way to make sure that they maintain at least a local copy of all of the relevant metadata, but the data volume itself is a challenge for them to be able to maintain local copies and control of that data, even if that is well within the technical right. It's just the technical capabilities a challenge. So let me move to the questions, and at the top of the list is, how does the governance framework described apply to satellite images, for example, that cover indigenous lands? Is there an expectation or an aspirational right of control? And I might add to that to include airborne as well. So maybe Andrew, if you want to start an answer there, and then see what we get from the other panelists,
Sure,
or
yeah,
others here with expertise.
yeah, I'd love to hear other options as well and other responses to that. Here, I was working on responses and hitting the character limit there, so I had to flip back to my Twitter days of working within that. Satellite images that cover indigenous lands. This is the challenge. Same with LiDAR as well. I've talked to some folks from the USGS who presented on LiDAR data and who were working with indigenous communities that, the scans were being done. And one of the issues that came up is that all of a sudden LiDAR data was exposing sacred sites on the landscape and trying to identify ways to sort of not block it out, because just putting a big black box on something, but to mask it could be a method of, trying to control that and provide better stewardship of that information, that data there. As far as satellite data, I'd have to scale up and have more conversations with folks and understand like what the concerns would be, one, and also what could potentially be done at that level. But LiDAR data is one area that I've had conversations with folks about, as far as masking and just making sure that stuff is not completely exposed as those height differences and those fluctuations within the landscape change there, because that is a concern as well. That's kind of an answer to your question. Sorry, Pierre, I don't have a definite answer, but that's an area that we're sort of exploring right now. And I'll continue to jump into the chat and respond where I can.
Okay. Thoughts from other panelists or other participants?
So I can go. So that is one of the things where we actually thought about in the paper. And it's a hard issue because, say, for example, you're doing some of the, like a MODIS data set that literally covers the whole globe, right? Well, that covers like 5,000 indigenous peoples, which is about how many there are around the world. And, even a large organization like NASA, I think, would be very challenged in trying to meet individual community needs for 5,000 different indigenous groups plus whatever else. But one of the things we thought about that I think Andrew actually kind of liked was the idea that, Mel, maybe you don't have to do it on an individual community by community basis, but maybe there could be larger organizations that talk to larger organizations and came up with sort of general strategies and that sort of thing. And so I, of course, being an ESIP member, thought, well, maybe ESIP could help with that.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of where I'm at on it. I don't know what Andrew thinks about that, but there has to be some way, because there's roughly that number of repositories around the world as well. It's the many thousand. And I don't think there's any way, that a repository that is dealing with global data can deal with, 5,000 different communities. So, and it goes both ways. I do know that most indigenous communities have a similar problem, that if there's a bunch of people who want to study them in all sorts of different aspects, they don't have the capacity to handle that many different research. Um, people trying to come and talk to them about that. So, it's a two-way scaling issue.
Yeah.
Definitely it's a two-way scaling issue. Sorry, Aaron, I just want to add really quick that there is, talking about in the example that Ruth gave, and I agree as well, like there's paths forward and exploring those are necessary, but the baseline for me in doing this sort of work is making it sustainable. So not just a one-time we've implemented care, we can move on. It's sustainability of keeping care going. Okay, so stop.
Thank you, Andrew, for those comments, and Ruth. And just to add a little bit, I've thought really hard about this, right? Data sovereignty, particularly from satellites, but also aircraft and drones. And there is, the potential, as we've described, for real harm to come from this, and we need to be very cognizant of that. And I think that there is a role, as much as I denigrated institutions there at the end, there is a role for institutions to, I think, really think about these bigger scale issues, particularly satellite data, that can be used very powerfully for good to help tackle transboundary issues around particularly resource management like water, but also can be used for ill, as Andrew and Ruth alluded to. In Bioscape, we experienced quite a lot of negative social media campaigning around what US aircraft were doing in South Africa. And were we spying on local communities, and were we changing the weather for local communities? But we also received equal support online in the social media world around people who were excited to have the attention of this technology on their home front to help them. And part of that is because we had done a really aggressive job of putting out media releases, talking to the community, being very visible and transparent about what we were doing, so that people could understand that the intention was for public benefit and social good. Locally here in California, there are folks that are working with drone data for digital heritage preservation with local tribal communities, where, again, these things are actually helping communities that want this type of information for their own heritage and history. But I don't think that we have a good solution for how to do this at different scales, not just in the United States, but across the world yet.
I will add to this in my capacity as the ORNLDAC manager. We are also responsible for the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment data, which is a NASA campaign in Alaska and Western Canada, which likewise touches on many Native people. And one of the things that we do recognize that we can do is, what are the ways that we lower the barriers to access to data, particularly for people with limited bandwidth and limited community, or with the limited compute capabilities. So how do we make it relatively easy to get subsets of the satellite data over a particular set of people's lands, and get them in formats that don't require a tremendous amount of remote sensing expertise? I mean, I can hand somebody a NetCDF file, but quite frankly, I'm a little bit challenged to crack a NetCDF file. And that becomes an issue for a fairly wide variety of stakeholders. So other thoughts or comments on this question? Let me, yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
I have, so thinking about Bruce, what you're talking about with having data in the cloud. I mean, I think that there's, one side of this that it democratizes access, like you're
Mhm.
talking about, but I also wonder about, and I put a question in Slido about the impact that AWS facilities have in particular environments. And so I wonder if there's guidance on choosing regions or, just how to think about those sort of impacts that cloud computing has.
I don't have a good answer to that. There's some questions there that are above what I feel comfortable answering. Others who have a thought or an answer to Aaron's questions, pop your hand up or throw it in chat. Aaron?
Aaron, I think that that's a great point, and is something, that maybe is one of those institutional frameworks to think about in terms of making decisions, at the institutional level. Another thing
Mhm.
that's come up in our conversations around cloud implementation for SAON in South Africa is that, the US West, they don't always have, the
Mhm.
same speed and access in South Africa to Amazon US West, right? So it's also the access isn't the same everywhere. And there is an outstanding question of sustainability with these technologies. Amazon is giving us, free and cheap compute now. But what is that going to look like 10 years from now? None of us know. But,
What
they're responsible to their shareholders, not to indigenous communities.
What is true, and I do want to clarify a couple points around this. Number one, what I'm looking at from the Ornell Docs perspective is what are the things that we're doing for people that they don't need to know or care where that data is hosted. Whether it's hosted on-prem here or in AWS, it should not require someone to have any AWS account or access. In what I'm talking about for the benefit of other communities. And NASA has been very clear that to the extent that it is practical to download data, downloading that data will continue to be free.
Absolutely. I don't have an issue. I agree, Bruce, about that point, but it's I think what we lose when we move to the cloud is the understanding about the energy consumption that the cloud servers take. And I think there's a real climate impact to cloud computing that gets kind of invisibilized.
There
and
is
there's a community and in, indigenous communities too that are impacted by those, by that usage. So yes, somewhere over here may have access, but you're impacting another community locally. So anyway, I think that's an open issue.
It is. It's not clear to me what the environmental impact difference is between running something in AWS versus running an equivalent set of infrastructure on-prem for me. I don't have a clear answer to that question. So the next question I want to throw up, for repositories or projects funded through groups that Indigenous people might not want to work with, how can we assure the care principles for those Indigenous people to trust? Thoughts, reactions?
I would say, like previously, that trust has to be built with the researchers in the communities beforehand. And I think, I'm not sure if I responded in the chat there, but what I was saying was pre-proposal. Those relationships get built. Something I've said in the past is relationships aren't built within a funding cycle. So, new researchers, new faculty coming in, understanding whose lands you're working on, understanding whose lands your institutions is built on, and building relationship with those folks. Understand the pre-tenure folks and other researchers are super busy, but at the same time, if you're looking to do this work, and this speaks to the sustainability of care implementation as well, building those relationships before even the ideation happens. But also that ideation process can come through those conversations and with indigenous people so you understand what their goals are. If you're in California doing fire research, wildfire research, or just, you know, cultural burning type research, there's interest of that. And so understanding what the goals and interests are of the communities themselves that are surrounding the area as well. And then you can sort of work with them to identify some of the issues that they've had at the local level, their own experience as a community of like what research has, you know, benefited them and what has gone awry. And understand like if a call comes out from a funding agency that they are not happy with and have had issues before, then understand why that is not a good space to occupy there. So I'll stop there.
Sure. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize what Andrew was saying about building this relationship, and it can't just be for the grant period of performance, which is the way a lot of researchers look at things. Is I'll go in, I'll build a relationship, I'll do my research, and I'll get out. And I think it has to be clearly communicated in many senses, depending on the community you're going into, that you need to become a part of that community. You need to really become a functional part of the community without an eye toward extracting maximum value from trust, because it becomes pretty transparent that that's why you're there. So I know that Aaron had mentioned something about parachute science in South Africa. It becoming part of the community tends to, you know, make that go away. So I know that's not our forte, but maybe that's would be a good session, how to build trust in communities, just as a skill, for a session in the future for ESIP.
Others? Jonathan and then Bob Downs.
Yeah, John Ralph and Matt Biddle brought up this idea of mask specific for indigenous areas, territories, or whatnot. And I think there are maps like that. But do we have, within the Earth science data systems, do we have the geospatial metadata that we need to, you know, cross-reference with, say, leaving the issues about mapping indigenous rights areas aside? That's a whole can of worms. On our side with the Earth science data, do we have the metadata and capabilities to interface with such a mask and to do you know, the necessary analysis of which data sets might be relevant to those and which indigenous peoples?
Bob, go ahead.
Thanks, Bruce. And here. So I'm thinking about the situation where there's multiple stakeholders involved, and for instance, if researchers are trying to get some data about some indigenous lands, and they're trying to figure out who to work with, and there might be some tribal leaders, but there could be others who also feel that their interests are important. And then also, as we think about migration of different indigenous tribes over time, it might be that the lands before one tribe was there, another tribe was there, and then some of the artifacts on those lands might be claimed or even associated with more than one tribe. And I'm just wondering if how these kinds of challenges are being worked with when there's a data collector involved and they're trying to work with all these groups.
So I feel like this
thoughts?
sort of question kind of came up for one of my fellow community members back in San Diego, who the museum approached the tribes in San Diego County and was saying like, hey, we have these collections. It's difficult to understand where they came from. They were collected years ago. And now they're trying to organize the mess that was created previously and understand, you know, which community they specifically came from. That's a
Sure.
challenge. That's a challenge. There's no doubt about that. And there's no simple or easy answer to that. These are ongoing conversations that have to be had at the community level with the correct people in the room.
Yeah, it could
Yeah,
even be more
it's a real life example of like what has happened with the mess that's been created, not by necessarily us, but by researchers who've come onto tribal lands previously and just collected and picked up different artifacts, and now they're housed in basements of sub basements, and it's just now coming to light.
It could even become more complicated once you start to get the repositories involved as well. So you've got the data producers and they're trying to, deposit the data in a repository, and meanwhile, the repository wants to do the right thing.
Mhm.
And, they would want to know, make sure that they're working with the right community members to move forward.
Yep.
Thanks.
Other comments on those topics? Moving to Dave Jones' question, is the data being collected that being used to communicate the impacts of climate change across all communities? That's a wide open. I suspect if the answer, if you say all communities, then the answer is almost by definition no. But other thoughts or responses? Is the data being collected being used to communicate the impact of climate change across all communities?
Was that question pointed to a specific presentation
It's
or?
not, but I think there is a question that maybe we can narrow it a little bit about approaches for helping Native communities get a handle on the impact of climate change in their environment.
Hey, Bruce, this is Dave. That's a good a good reframing of the question. I was just thinking that maybe, with all this wonderful data collection that's happening throughout, indigenous locations, that this information could be used in a very positive way to help educate those changes that are going on and how it may impact those communities. So when I said all communities, I didn't mean, are we moving forward without touching everyone, but just a more broader question.
I can speak to that there are some ways that this is being done in the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, where at the last Above Science team meeting, there was a day specifically devoted to some meetings with elders and some times where there are parts of Above that are going out to the elders to both listen to what those folks have to say about the impacts that they observe, but also to try to make sure that they have access to the data so that they can use the satellite, the airborne, the ground data in ways to augment their local knowledge. So I know of at least one example, but other thoughts or examples might be worth bringing up.
Dave and Bruce, thank you for that response. Better understanding now. I would say, like, myself being involved with multiple projects that we have going on, I would point to my colleague, Dr. Lydia Jennings, who is a pedologist and has spoke a lot about care and data sovereignty work as well. She points to a lot of work being done around climate change. And so maybe I can link some of her presentations in the notes that she's given in the past, where she's talked about the impact of climate change on culturally important plants and spaces as well. So somewhat, I want to say the University of Minnesota, maybe doing projects around Manoomin, the wild rice that is grown out there. This is incredibly culturally important to the, I believe, Ojibwe folks is out there. So yes, this is ongoing. This data collection is happening as well, and that understand the impact of climate change on these culturally specific plant species is going.
Other comments along those lines?
I know that in Alaska, some of the native corporations, et cetera, have been working to understand their own how climate change is impacting their own communities in many ways, including not just the issues of flooding and lack of sea ice and that sort of thing, but how it's changing their ability to harvest foods, et cetera. And in some cases that has gone pretty far towards basically establishing their own research programs, which I think is pretty darn cool.
That is cool. And I've talked to tribal community members like in my community and outside of like, what would it look like if tribes were able to put out their own requests for proposals, their own RFPs, and identify and communicate outwards, so that two-way communication street is happening between the communities and the university researchers or researchers at private institutions as well. That's a goal of mine. I would love to see that. To see where how funding can be negotiated throughout that, and data protection protocols, and what could be open and shared and what would be protected. But that goes to the aspirational nature of the work that I do.
And then I saw the link, Andrew. I'll make sure that the links get updated in the document. So I've pointed to that care page that you've mentioned. And I'll point more specifically, and just more generally about the resources. I'll take a pass through all of the stuff that's been provided in chat and so forth that we can update at Google Doc, and I very much welcome the contributions of others there. As we start to head towards the end of this session and next steps, so from within ESIP, there's work going on in the sustainable data cluster. Ruth and Bob Downs, at least in this group, are involved with that. Those meetings are posted on the ESIP calendar. And I think we've got some links to a little bit more information about that. Ruth, Bob, anyone want to comment on sort of next steps, where you're going, what you guys will be working on next?
Right. Well, we're going, we have a meeting, Andrew mentioned it, that we have a meeting set up to go over the paper to see if we think it's ready for broader review and eventual submission next week, actually. So that's the first step. And then the second thing I note is that I do think the ESIP data repository groups, there are a lot of people interested in metadata related to implementation of care, et cetera. That's why I mentioned the metadata communique. I also should probably mention that in IEEE, there is a draft Indigenous provenance specification that is out for review. If you're an IEEE member or a member of an Indigenous group, you can get access to that. I haven't seen it because I'm not an IEEE member or but those things are happening, and I think there is probably significant interest that I mean, I would not recommend that ESIP do anything with Indigenous metadata without participation from Indigenous communities. Because I will say that our group actually started off by drafting what we thought were possibly appropriate links between the CARE principles and the repository recommendations we were making for the CARE principles. And our first guesses were practically all wrong when we started actually getting Andrew and his group to review that work, and almost all of them got updated, I would say. So so I think it's really an issue of what can ESIP do to move all of this forward. I think the answer is nothing unless we have that collaboration with, say, for example, Andrew and his group going forward. So I guess the issue is stay tuned.
Mhm.
And I just wanted to add to that we would certainly welcome other members of ESIP who would like to join the ESIP Sustainable Data Management Cluster. We're getting this paper out the door very soon, we hope, but we would like to work on other activities as well, and we're certainly open to suggestions from others who would like to come and join. Thanks.
Mhm. Great. Stephen Formel, go ahead, please.
Yeah, that was actually that last comment was helpful, a helpful segue for a question I've had, which is, I work with some big data aggregators, and I know that many of us sort of our main connecting points as a community are through programs and projects and sort of aggregatory points. I have been sort of, casually trying to keep my eyes open for similar organizations within tribal communities and nations. And I just put a link in the chat to one such organization I have found. But I'm curious if other people are aware of these type of other organizations that maybe we could coordinate that information as a way to try to reach out and connect with these communities that are at these same sort of aggregation points, that where the organization level is similar to like the way that we work. Because for me, I don't have a lot of opportunities to necessarily interact with individual community members as much as like these bigger entities. I hope that made sense.
I see what you've added. We'll make sure to get that added into the slide. And I think what I'm hearing is anybody else want to come off mute to make some comments or toss some suggestions into the Slack or into the chat? Sorry. So I agree with you. I'm looking for some of those same things, and it comes into a question that came up in the Coptis discussion yesterday. But this is an area where I'm particularly interested in how do we get behind stuff that's already happening? And then I think today has been very valuable from my perspective in doing that. Susan Shingledecker, I can pick on you for a minute. And are there thoughts you would care to throw out about other things going on within the ESIP framework relevant to this conversation? And I'll preface that by specifically acknowledging Megan and her role as community trying to connect people up. And Megan is directly responsible for some of the connections that brought some of the panelists in. So she's not, I think, in the room at the moment, but I do want to publicly thank her.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Bruce. I would say that the way the ESIP cluster model works is you take a group of people who are interested and passionate about a particular topic or about a particular angle on that topic, and we provide the place for you to come together and work and collaborate on that issue. And as Megan would say, some clusters, spin up, solve a very specific problem, or work on a very specific output. They finish their work and they go away, and that can be success. And then some clusters form up around an idea. They do one piece of work and then they say, okay, what's next? And then they do that piece of work and then they say, what's next? And so the group evolves, and maybe the composition of the group evolves as the issue evolves. And that actually will be a little bit about what I talk about in our closing plenary, is like, who are the people you need to bring in to solve the current challenge that you're looking at? And I would say that the current Sustainable Data Management Group is doing great work, and their focus has been on this paper, which they are working on, and they are close to, I think, launch on. And it's amazing to see such a robust discussion with new voices, ESIP regulars and newcomers here, 40 people really passionate and really engaged. So what do you want to do, right? Where do we want to take this? And I think that that's part of what Megan in her role as community director does in this forming, norming, storming, performing, that whole cycle of group dynamics, and say, okay, the Sustainable Data Management Cluster has done some great things to date. Where does this community see the next most urgent and needed work to happen? And who are the people that have the time and want to engage and take the work, take the work forward in the next step? So it's really defining, knowing that you can't boil the ocean. We probably can't take everything on at once, but what's the next thing that ESIP is uniquely positioned, right? As a place where it's issues that span one entity or one organization that we could take on. So that would be kind of my my take. Other places in ESIP where you'll see kind of this discussion, as Ruth noted, certainly in the semantics area, Kathy Todd Brown in the operational ethics area is having some really interesting questions about how to run ethical meetings and setting a space that is ethical. So those are kind of the three areas that I would say, but it's how do we figure out who wants to engage, right? So maybe in the note stock, it's about, highlighting your name or bolding your name if you want to be part of the group moving this forward. And then, and I forgot to mention, also I'll be highlighting in our closing plenary. So the ESIP board formally stood up our Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Justice Administrative Committee. So for the last year and a half, we have had an advisory committee, which was kind of a forming group, and Bruce was one of our co-chairs for that. The board just last week voted to make that a permanent administrative committee that is being chaired by Steve Diggs. And I'm taking away all my thunder for this afternoon. Thank you to Steve. And so again, that group will be looking at shaping their agenda. So there's kind of, as I see it, the Sustainable Data Management Cluster has been looking at these issues like care principles in practice out in the world. We'll see where the EDIJ committee wants to put their focus. And then I would also draw your attention to some of that crossover in the semantic spaces, but also with the operational ethics cluster. So there's a lot, and you can always reach out to ESIP staff and say, all right, this is my interest, and where should I plug in, and we'll help guide the way. Make sense?
Yep. So other closing thoughts or additions in the last few minutes that we've got together this afternoon now or this morning for some of us? I think what I have seen is that our community fellows are working to incorporate the chat and the links and so forth so that we make sure that all of that info gets preserved in that Google Doc. You should retain access to that Google Doc through the Kiko chat to be able to come back to that. I know I have gone back to some of the docs for previous sessions in trying to loop some things together and catch up on a few things that I've missed. Talks get recorded and posted to YouTube, so we have some opportunities, and I have linked to a couple of previous ESIP YouTube recordings in that document. So I think that's got everything today. I thank everybody for their thoughts and participation. I appreciate the preparation of the panelists for today's conversation. and let's see what we can do to change the world. What do each of us need to start doing or do more of, keep doing, stop doing or do less of? All right. Thanks, everybody.